dog was covered in another man's blood when she found him. Wren Holloway would remember that detail long after everything else about that night blurred. The rain hammering the tin roof of her clinic, the low growl rattling out of 140 pounds of trembling muscle, and the way the animal's eyes tracked her every movement like he was deciding, in real time, whether she was a threat worth dying to stop. He was a cane Corso, brindle-coated, scarred across one shoulder in a way that spoke of old violence, and he had dragged himself 3 miles through a storm to collapse against the back door of a dockside animal clinic that most of the city didn't even know existed. She knelt in the doorway with her hands open and her voice low, the way she used to when she still wore a different uniform and answered to a different name, and she said the only thing that made sense in that moment. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." She had no idea that the dog belonged to a man who could burn the whole city down looking for him, and that within 48 hours that man would be standing in her waiting room in a coat that cost more than her rent, asking questions in a voice so quiet it made the walls feel thinner. His name was Dorian Cade, and men in 3 different territories flinched at the sound of it. He ran Cade Holdings out of a glass tower on the harbor. Shipping contracts, freight logistics, a name stitched into half the import manifests on the eastern seaboard. That was the version the city believed. The version that mattered moved through the same docks at night, in containers nobody was supposed to open, under a silence so absolute that even the police who suspected the truth had learned not to go looking for it. Dorian had built that silence himself, brick by brick, since he was 24 years old and had watched his father bleed out on a warehouse floor with no one left to trust. He didn't raise his voice anymore. He didn't have to. Men who worked for him said the worst thing about Dorian Cade wasn't his temper. It was the absence of one. He listened. He watched. And when he finally spoke, it was already too late for whoever he was speaking to. The one soft thing left in him had 4 legs and a scar across his shoulder that Dorian had put a bullet through the man who caused it. The dog's name was Bruno, and he had belonged, before Dorian, to Dorian's father, the last living piece of a man who'd trained him not as a pet, but as something closer to a partner, back when Marcus Cade had worn a badge, before he ever wore a title in this world. Bruno slept in Dorian's office. Bruno rode in the front seat of a car that never let anyone else touch the wheel. And 3 nights before, Wren found him bleeding on her doorstep. Bruno had watched his handler's convoy get torn apart by gunfire on a service road outside the harbor, had taken a blade meant for Dorian's throat, and had vanished into the dark before anyone could pull him back. Dorian searched for him the way other men searched for something they couldn't survive losing twice. Before we go any further into this, if you're the kind of person who loves stories built on power, obsession, and the kind of truth that doesn't want to be found, this is exactly the channel for you. Hit that like button, subscribe to the Mafia Boss Stories, and tell me in the comments, if a wounded animal showed up at your door in the middle of the night, carrying a secret bigger than you knew, would you have let him in? Now, back to Wren, and the dog, and the man who was about to walk into her life like a slow-moving storm front. Wren didn't know any of that yet. What she knew was blood loss, a laceration along the ribs that needed sutures, and a dog too traumatized to let a stranger near him without a fight. What she also knew, though almost no one in the city did, was exactly how to read an animal like that. Because 6 years ago, before the clinic, before the quiet dockside life she'd built for herself, Wren Holloway had worn combat boots and a service harness of her own, working alongside dogs trained to find things buried deep enough that no one else could. She had been a military K-9 handler, specializing in detection work most people never had reason to think about. Cadaver recovery, evidence tracking, scent memory reconstruction. She'd left that life behind after an operation that ended, with a dog she loved bleeding out in her arms, and a report that buried the truth of what had actually happened that day. She didn't talk about it. She'd built a small, unglamorous rescue clinic on the edge of the harbor, precisely because it asked nothing of her except steady hands and patience, and because nobody who walked through her door ever looked twice at the woman in the flannel shirt covered in fur and antiseptic. They saw a stray dog lady. They never saw what she used to be. That was about to become the only thing that mattered. Dorian Cade found the clinic on the second night, after his men had turned over every kennel, every vet's office, every alley within 5 miles of the ambush site. He didn't send someone else. That was the detail that would come to define everything that followed. Dorian Cade, who delegated the running of an empire to lieutenants he trusted with money and silence, walked through Wren Holloway's front door himself at 11 at night, in a coat still damp from the rain, and said 4 words that carried more weight than any threat could have. "I need my dog." Wren looked up from the counter, unimpressed by the coat, unimpressed by the 2 men who'd stayed outside like shadows cut from the dark. She'd learned a long time ago that the men who needed an entourage to feel dangerous rarely were the ones worth fearing. The ones worth fearing walked in alone. "Depends which dog," she said, "and depends who's asking." Something flickered behind Dorian's eyes. Not anger. Not yet. Something closer to surprise. He wasn't used to being asked to explain himself twice. Cane Corso, brindle, scar on the left shoulder. He would have come in hurt. Wren's hand tightened, almost imperceptibly, on the edge of the counter. She had spent the last 36 hours with that exact dog curled in the back kennel, refusing food from anyone but her, flinching at every raised voice from the street. She had also spent those 36 hours noticing things about him that didn't fit the story of an ordinary pet. The way he held his body when a door slammed, coiled and ready, trained for it. The way his eyes tracked exits before they tracked people. The way, when she'd finally gotten close enough to check his tags, she'd found none. No collar. No chip. A dog that valuable, that clearly cared for, and someone had made absolutely sure he could never be traced back to an owner. That wasn't neglect. That was strategy. And Wren Holloway, whatever else she'd left behind when she hung up her old life, had never lost the instinct that told her when something didn't add up. "He's here," she said carefully. "He's stable, and he's not going anywhere until I understand why a dog this well-trained showed up on my doorstep with no ID and someone else's blood on his coat." The silence that followed lasted longer than it should have. Dorian Cade was a man used to rooms rearranging themselves around his patients, and here was a woman in a clinic that smelled like antiseptic and wet dog, telling him he would wait. He should have been furious. Instead, something in his chest, something he hadn't felt reorganize itself in longer than he could remember, simply stopped and looked at her. "Show me," he said. Not a demand. Almost, if she hadn't known better, a request. She led him back through the clinic, past the low hum of refrigeration units and the smell of iodine, to a kennel in the quiet corner where Bruno lay curled against the wall, ribs rising and falling in shallow, guarded breaths. The moment the dog's head lifted and he caught Dorian's scent, something in the animal's entire body unraveled. The tension broke. The growl that had lived in his throat for 2 days dissolved into a low whine, and he dragged himself up on unsteady legs to press against the wire mesh separating them. Dorian went down on one knee without seeming to decide to. For 3 full seconds, the most feared man on the eastern harbor pressed his forehead to a chain-link fence and said nothing at all, and Wren, who had learned to read silence for a living, understood in that moment that whatever else Dorian Cade was capable of, this was not performance. "He took a blade meant for me," Dorian said finally, not looking up. 3 nights ago. Then he ran. He didn't run, Ren said. He came here because this was the only place within 3 miles that didn't smell like a threat. That's not instinct. That's training. She crouched beside him, keeping the fence between them and the dog, watching Dorian's face rather than the animal now. Who trained him? A long pause. My father. Your father trained protection dogs? Dorian's jaw worked once, a muscle flexing beneath skin that had learned, a long time ago, not to give anything away for free. My father, he said, trained a lot of things people don't talk about anymore. Ren filed that away the way she'd once filed away every scrap of information in the field. Quietly, completely, without letting her face show that she'd noticed it mattered. Because something about the way Bruno moved, the specific discipline in his stillness, the very particular way he'd sat frozen at attention, the one time a delivery truck backfired outside her window that afternoon. That wasn't protection training. She'd worked beside dogs trained for protection. This was something else. This was detection work. And detection dogs, in Ren's old life, only ever meant one thing was being searched for. She didn't say any of that yet. She only said, he needs another week before he's fit to move. You can visit. You can't take him early. Not with that wound. And then, because some old instinct told her the truth, mattered more than caution in that moment. And when he's ready, I want to know what he was trained to find. Because I don't think it was intruders. Dorian looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression, careful, assessing, faintly, dangerously curious, told her he had just decided she was either the most useful person he'd met in years, or the most dangerous. He came back the next night, and the night after that. Not because Bruno needed him to. The dog was healing, steady, calm in a way that surprised even Ren. But because something about the clinic, about the quiet woman who spoke to broken animals, like they were owed patience rather than pity, had lodged itself somewhere in Dorian Cade that he didn't have a name for yet. He told himself it was gratitude. Men like him didn't do gratitude well. It curdled fast into obligation, and obligation into something more dangerous. He watched her work, stitching a stray cat's torn ear with the same steady hands she'd use, unknowingly, to eventually unravel everything he'd spent 15 years burying. And he found himself talking. Not about the business. Never about the business. But about his father. About the warehouse where Marcus Cade had died. About the silence that had swallowed Dorian whole the day he inherited an empire he'd never asked for, and a dog that was the only creature left who remembered what his father sounded like before the world hardened him. Ren listened the way she used to listen in the field, completely, without judgment, cataloging every detail. And every detail she gathered confirmed what she'd already begun to suspect. Bruno hadn't just been trained to protect. He'd been trained to search. And there was only one reason a career criminal's father would have needed a dog that could find things other people desperately wanted to stay buried. The break came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the storm that had brought Bruno to her door. Dorian had started bringing him by the harbor road near the old Cade warehouse for slow, careful walks as the wound healed. A stretch of cracked pavement and rusted shipping containers that had sat abandoned since before Dorian took over the business. Ren came with them that evening, ostensibly to monitor the dog's gait, though both of them had stopped pretending the visits were purely medical. They walked in the gray hush of early evening, Bruno moving easy and unhurried at Dorian's side, until they passed within 30 feet of container row 17. And the dog went rigid, not aggressive, not afraid. Focused in a way Ren recognized instantly, bone deep, from a life she'd tried to leave behind. Bruno sat, perfectly, precisely, the way a trained dog sits when it has located exactly what it was built to find, and waits, patient, unmoving, for a human to catch up. Dorian, Ren said quietly, and something in her voice made him go still beside her. That's an alert. An alert for what? She looked at the rusted container, at the dog sitting motionless in front of it, with the discipline of an animal that had done this 100 times before, in a life neither of them had been present for, and she felt the old, cold clarity of her former life settle back over her like a second skin. I need you to think very carefully, she said, about what your father might have buried out here that he trained a dog to find again. Dorian didn't answer for a long time. Then, in a voice stripped of every ounce of the calm he wore like armor, he said the truth he had spent 15 years refusing to look at directly. I don't know. I was 24. I inherited the business 3 days after he died, and Silas Branch handed me the paperwork and told me not to ask questions about the transition. I never asked. Ren's eyes moved from the container to the name that had just left his mouth, and something cold settled in her stomach, because in the 3 weeks she'd spent quietly, carefully studying the periphery of Dorian Cade's world, one name had come up more often than any other, always in the same breath as loyalty, always positioned just close enough to Dorian to see everything, and just far enough to never be blamed for anything. Silas Branch, Dorian's second in command, the man who had stood beside him at his father's funeral, the man who had handled the transition. I think, Ren said slowly, that you need to open that container, and I think you need to do it before Silas Branch finds out we were standing here. She had no way of knowing, in that quiet gray moment on the harbor road, just how right and how late that instinct already was. Dorian didn't open the container that night. He couldn't, not without cutting officers he didn't trust, not without evidence he could control, not without giving Silas Branch a single second of warning. He was above everything else, a man who understood patience as a weapon, and so instead of tearing the harbor apart, he did something far more dangerous. He went home, sat across from the man who had run his empire's day-to-day business for 15 years, and studied him the way Bruno had studied that container. Still, silent, waiting for the smallest flicker of truth to surface. Silas Branch was 51 years old, gray at the temples, a man who wore loyalty like a well-tailored suit, and had never once, in 15 years, raised his voice or his hand. He had also, Dorian now understood, been the last man standing in the room the night Marcus Cade died, and the first man to hand a grieving 24-year-old a stack of papers and a new life he never chose. You've been quiet, Silas said, pouring 2 glasses of something amber and expensive, the way he always did when he wanted to seem generous. Something on your mind? The dog, Dorian said, watching him closely. Found something out by container row 17 today. He watched it happen, the almost imperceptible tightening around Silas's eyes, the half-second pause before the glass reached his lips, the practiced calm that came a beat too late to be real. 15 years of reading men across boardroom tables and back-alley meetings had taught Dorian Cade to catch exactly that kind of hesitation, and in that half-second, something in him went colder than it had in 15 years. Old storage, Silas said smoothly. Nothing worth digging up. Funny, Dorian said, standing, keeping his voice level, keeping every ounce of the fury clawing up his spine, locked behind a face that gave away nothing. Because my father trained that dog to find exactly one thing, and he never buried cargo. He didn't wait for an answer. He walked out, and for the first time in 15 years, Dorian Cade understood that the man who had built the last decade and a half of his life at his side might also be the man responsible for ending the life that came before it. Ren spent that night in her clinic, doing something she hadn't allowed herself to do in 6 years. She pulled every old contact she still had, quietly, carefully, through channels that no longer officially existed for her. She wasn't law enforcement anymore. She had no jurisdiction, no badge, no protection if this went wrong. But she still remembered how to read a scent alert pattern, still remembered the protocols for documenting a K9 find in a way that would hold up if it ever needed to. And more than that, she remembered exactly what it felt like to watch someone bury the truth about a death because the truth was inconvenient to powerful men, because that was exactly what had happened to her 6 years ago, to a dog she loved and a report that never told the real story. She was not going to watch it happen again. Not here. Not to a man whose armor, she was beginning to realize, had never once been as solid as the city believed. Because that was the thing Wren had started to see clearly in the 3 weeks since Bruno had collapsed against her door. Dorian Cade's control wasn't cruelty dressed up as composure. It was grief, calcified into discipline, because a 24-year-old boy had lost his father and been handed a war he never trained for, and had survived it by turning every soft place in himself into stone. She had watched that stone crack, slowly, deliberately, every night he sat in her clinic, talking about a father he barely let himself remember out loud. And she understood, with a clarity that frightened her more than any container full of old secrets, that she had stopped treating this as a case somewhere in the last 2 weeks. She had started caring what happened to him. That was a dangerous thing to feel about a man who ran an empire built on silence. She knew it. She let herself feel it anyway. There was a moment, 2 nights before the confrontation, when Dorian almost told her to walk away from all of it. He'd shown up at the clinic past midnight, uninvited, pacing the small waiting room like a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. And when Wren finally asked him what was wrong, he'd looked at her with something close to fear, an expression she suspected very few people in his life had ever been allowed to witness. "If this goes the way I think it's going to go," he said, "there are men in this city who will start asking who you are, what you know, whether you're a liability to clean up or a threat to remove. I've spent 15 years making sure nobody I care about becomes a target. I don't know how to protect you from this and still finish it." Wren had crossed the room, taken his face in both hands the way she used to steady a frightened animal before a procedure it didn't understand, and told him the truth she'd been circling for weeks. "I spent 6 years hiding from the last time I let the truth get buried, because I was afraid of what it would cost me to dig it up. I'm not doing that again. Not for you, not for anyone. Let me help you finish this, and then we can figure out what happens after." He hadn't argued. He'd simply nodded. Once, the way men like him nodded when they'd finally stopped fighting a decision that had already been made for them by something stronger than fear. The confrontation came 4 nights later, in the cold, fluorescent light of the very warehouse where Marcus Cade had bled out 15 years earlier, a location Dorian chose deliberately, because if Silas Branch was going to answer for what happened there, he was going to answer for it, standing on the exact spot where it had happened. Dorian brought 2 men he trusted with his life. He brought Bruno, healed enough now to walk unassisted, moving with the quiet, coiled readiness of an animal that understood exactly what kind of night this was. And against every instinct that told him to keep her far away from what was coming, he brought Wren, because the case they were about to make needed someone who could read a scent alert in a way that would hold up to scrutiny, and because some smaller, more honest part of him no longer wanted to face this without her standing beside him. Silas arrived expecting a business meeting. He left understanding it was a reckoning. 15 years, Dorian said, his voice quiet in the way that had always meant something worse than shouting. "You told me my father died because a rival shipment went wrong, that the men who did it were dead within the month, and the debt was settled." I believed you because you were the only person left standing who claimed to have been in the room." "I was in the room," Silas said, and for the first time in 15 years, something brittle showed beneath the composed surface. "You were the room," Dorian said. "You handed me a story instead of a father, and I built an empire on top of it, without ever asking why the man who told it to me was also the man who inherited the most power the moment my father stopped breathing." Wren stepped forward then, Bruno steady at her side, and released him toward Container 17. Dragged from the harbor to the warehouse floor that same afternoon, under cover of Dorian's own men, resealed evidence waiting for exactly this moment. The dog moved without hesitation, precise and certain, and sat before the crate with the same unbroken discipline he'd shown weeks earlier on the docks. "Cadaver and evidence recovery," Wren said, loud enough for every man in the room to hear. "Trained by Marcus Cade himself, which means Marcus Cade knew, before he died, that something was buried on his own property that needed finding again. A man doesn't train a search dog for evidence he trusts. He trains one because he suspects he's the only person he can trust." The crate, when it was finally forced open under harsh warehouse light, didn't hold a body. It held something almost worse in the particular economy of men like Dorian Cade. 15 years of ledgers, records, and a single handwritten note in Marcus Cade's own hand, dated 3 days before his death, naming the man he believed was systematically skimming profit from every shipment that passed through the harbor and quietly building loyalty among Marcus's own lieutenants for the day he decided to take the whole operation for himself. The note didn't name Silas Branch directly. It didn't have to. Every ledger inside that crate, cross-referenced against 15 years of records Dorian had trusted blindly, told the same story in Silas's own handwriting. Silas Branch had not simply inherited chaos after Marcus Cade's death, he had engineered it. What followed was not the kind of climax the city's rumor mill would ever hear the true shape of. No gunfire, no dramatic chase through harbor streets. Dorian Cade didn't need violence to end 15 years of quiet betrayal. He had built an empire on the understanding that the most permanent damage a man could do to another was to simply, calmly, take away everything they'd built their power on. By morning, every account Silas Branch had hidden behind Cade Holdings's name had been frozen. Every loyalty he'd quietly cultivated among the organization's lower ranks had been publicly, deliberately dismantled. And the man who had stood beside Dorian at his father's funeral found himself standing instead, at the edge of the harbor, with nothing left of the empire he'd spent 15 years trying to steal one careful year at a time. Dorian let him walk, not out of mercy. Wren understood, watching his face in that final confrontation, that mercy had very little to do with it. He let him walk because the truth, once fully exposed, was a heavier sentence than anything Dorian could have inflicted with his own hands, and because for the first time in 15 years, Dorian Cade didn't need to prove his power to anyone. He had simply, finally, taken it back. The weeks that followed felt, to Wren, like watching a man learn to breathe in a body that had spent 15 years braced for the next blow. Dorian came to the clinic, less like a man visiting his dog, and more like a man who had finally found somewhere he didn't have to perform his own composure. And Wren, who had spent 6 years convincing herself that the quiet dockside life she'd built was penance enough for everything she'd left behind, found herself, for the first time since she'd hung up her old uniform, wanting something more than quiet. She wanted this. She wanted the careful, unhurried way Dorian watched her work. She wanted the evenings that stretched into harbor walks, that had nothing left to do with evidence or alerts, only with two people who had both spent years turning themselves into armor learning, slowly, how to set it down. It was Bruno, in the end, who made the final introduction unnecessary. On a clear evening 3 months after the storm that had first brought him bleeding to her door, the old cane Corso settled himself, without ceremony, in the space between them, on the porch of Wren's clinic, the same spot he claimed every evening now, as if he'd decided, in whatever quiet animal certainty dogs are given, that this was exactly where the two halves of his broken world belonged. Dorian reached over him, found Wren's hand resting on the worn wood between them, and for the first time in 15 years, let himself hold on to something without calculating what it might cost him to lose it. "You know," Wren said quietly, watching the harbor lights flicker on across the water, "for a man who runs half the docks in this city, you're remarkably bad at asking for what you want." "I've had a lot of practice not wanting anything," Dorian said. "You're the first thing in 15 years I didn't have to convince myself I could survive losing." She didn't answer that with words. She didn't need to. Bruno, sensing something settle in the two people flanking him, exhaled a long, contented breath and let his head fall against Dorian's knee. The same quiet trust he'd shown a scared, injured stranger on a stormy night 3 months earlier. The trust that had cracked open an empire's oldest lie. And, in doing so, given a hollowed-out man back the one thing 15 years of power had never been able to buy him. Someone worth being unguarded for. If you were captivated by Wren's hidden strength and Dorian's dark, unraveling obsession, don't forget to hit that like button. We love bringing you these intense stories filled with betrayal, power, and unexpected twists. What would you have done in Wren's shoes? Walked away from a man with that much danger circling him, or stayed to find out what he was hiding underneath it? Drop a comment below and let us know. Make sure to subscribe to the Mafia Boss Stories and turn on notifications so you never miss a story.